By the spring of 1945, the Pacific War was entering its most decisive phase. After the brutal campaigns in the Marianas, the Philippines, and Iwo Jima, one final stepping stone remained before an invasion of the Japanese home islands, Okinawa. This island, just 350 miles from Kyushu, was not only strategically critical, it was also the gateway to Japan itself. Whoever controlled Okinawa would control the staging ground for the final assault. The Allied plan, codenamed Operation Iceberg, aimed to seize the island in a massive amphibious assault. The stakes could not have been higher. For the United States, this was the key to ending the war as quickly as possible. For Japan, Okinawa was the last defensive wall. Defeat here would open the heart of the empire to direct attack. American commanders knew the fight would be unlike any before. The Japanese had learned from previous island battles and prepared an elaborate defense in depth. Instead of trying to stop the invasion at the beaches, they dug into the rugged southern hills, turning caves and ridges into nearly impregnable fortresses. This meant that every mile of progress would be paid for in blood. On April 1, 1945, Easter Sunday, the largest amphibious assault of the Pacific War began. More than 1,300 ships approached Okinawa's western coast, carrying the U.S. 10th Army, the battle-hardened 6th Marine Division and the 7th, 27th, 77th, and 96th Infantry Divisions. Naval guns roared for hours, shaking the island to its core. Waves of landing craft raced toward the shore. But when the first Marines and soldiers stormed ashore, they found, to their astonishment, almost no resistance. This was exactly what the Japanese wanted. They had deliberately allowed the Americans to land unopposed, drawing them inland into carefully prepared killing zones. What seemed like an easy landing was in fact the opening move in one of the bloodiest battles of the war. Before we continue deeper into this pivotal campaign, take a moment to support our work. If you enjoy in-depth, historically accurate documentaries like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share it with others who value real history. It helps us bring you more detailed accounts of the events that shaped our world. From here, the calm of April 1st would give way to weeks of unrelenting combat, and the true horror of Okinawa was yet to begin. Just 5 days after the seemingly effortless landings, the battle for Okinawa took a dark and deadly turn. On April 6, 1945, the Japanese unleashed Kikusui, a massive, coordinated wave of suicide air attacks that would terrorize the U.S. fleet for weeks. This was no isolated assault. It was a desperate gamble, combining kamikaze pilots, conventional bombers, and even small suicide boats to strike at the heart of the Allied invasion force. At dawn, radar screens aboard U.S. ships began to glow with ominous blips. Over 350 Japanese aircraft were inbound, diving from the skies in coordinated waves. They came in low, hugging the sea to avoid detection, before suddenly pulling up into suicidal climbs. For the pilots, this was a one-way mission, a deliberate sacrifice for the emperor. For the Americans, it was a nightmare made real. Destroyers and picket ships bore the brunt of the attack. These smaller vessels were stationed far from the main fleet to provide early warning, but they quickly became the primary targets. Many were hit in rapid succession, their decks erupting in flames as ammunition stores exploded. Sailors fought to save their ships, manning anti-aircraft guns until the heat forced them back or enemy fire cut them down. The kamikazes struck with terrifying precision. Ships like the USS Bush and USS Colquhoun were torn apart. The waters off Okinawa turned into burning graveyards of twisted steel. In just 2 days, more than 20 American ships were sunk or heavily damaged. The losses in men were staggering, hundreds killed in an instant, thousands wounded. But the Japanese weren't finished. On April 7, a second wave of suicide planes roared in, this time accompanied by one of the most audacious naval sacrifices of the war. The battleship Yamato, pride of the Imperial Navy, sailed on a one-way voyage toward Okinawa. Her mission was suicide, beach herself, fight to the last gun, and draw American forces into a bloody showdown. She never made it. U.S. carrier aircraft found and sank her in a furious aerial assault, sending the giant ship to the bottom along with most of her crew. These days marked the beginning of an unrelenting kamikaze campaign that would continue until the battle's end. For the U.S. Navy, Okinawa became the deadliest struggle of the Pacific War, not on the beaches, but in the skies above the sea. And for the soldiers and Marines ashore, this was only the prelude to the brutal ground fighting that awaited them in the island south. While the seas raged with kamikaze firestorms, the battle on Okinawa's southern front descended into a nightmare of attrition. After the rapid success of the northern advance, American commanders had hoped the South would fall just as quickly. Instead, beginning in early April, they encountered one of the most formidable defensive systems of the entire Pacific War, the Shuri Line. Stretching across the narrow waist of the island, this network of defenses was no simple trench system. It was a labyrinth of deeply dug bunkers, interconnected tunnels, and fortified cave systems carved into limestone hills. Japanese engineers had spent months transforming the rugged terrain into a fortress, allowing defenders to survive even the heaviest bombardments. The strategy was clear: bleed the Americans white. U.S. forces advanced behind rolling artillery barrages, but each gain was measured in yards, not miles. The 96th Infantry Division and the 7th Infantry Division found themselves locked in grinding combat, where every ridgeline had to be taken multiple times. Rain turned fields into swamps, bogging down tanks and turning foxholes into muddy graves. Rotting bodies lay in no man's land, a grim reminder of the cost of every attack. The Japanese fought with calculated patience. Rather than waste men in reckless banzai charges, they fought from concealed positions, retreating only when absolutely necessary. Snipers picked off officers. Mortars and artillery rained down with uncanny accuracy. Cave systems allowed enemy troops to vanish under fire, only to reappear behind advancing Americans. Each hill, Kakazu Ridge, Dakeshi Ridge, Sugar Loaf Hill, became a killing ground. Casualties mounted at a shocking pace. Units rotated in and out of the front lines, often leaving behind half their original strength. Evacuation hospitals overflowed with the wounded. Men fought on despite dysentery, malaria, and exhaustion, driven forward by orders and the knowledge that stopping meant dying in place. Adding to the misery, the rainy season arrived in early May. Torrential downpours reduced visibility, turned roads into rivers of mud, and made evacuation nearly impossible. Soldiers slept soaked to the bone, their gear caked in grime, their rifles rusting in their hands. Yet the advance had to continue. Okinawa was the last major stepping stone before Japan itself, and every day of delay cost lives. By mid-May, the Americans were still far from breaking the Shuri line. The Japanese 32nd Army, under General Mitsuru Ushijima, remained unshaken, its soldiers willing to fight to the death. The battle had transformed from a swift island assault into a protracted, grinding siege. And the closer U.S. forces pushed toward the heart of the line, the more ferocious the resistance became. What awaited them ahead would test not only their strength but their very endurance as human beings. The next phase would see some of the bloodiest fighting of the Pacific, and the breaking point was still far from sight. By late May 1945, the Battle of Okinawa had been grinding on for nearly 2 months, and the Shuri line still held. The Americans, battered and exhausted, had thrown division after division against its fortified ridges and cave complexes, but progress remained painfully slow. Yet intelligence reports indicated that Japanese forces were finally beginning to weaken under relentless pressure. Supplies were dwindling, casualties were mounting, and even the most determined defenders could not endure forever. The final push to break the Shuri line began on May 22. Artillery units unleashed one of the heaviest bombardments of the Pacific War. For hours, the skies over southern Okinawa thundered with naval gunfire, heavy mortars, and airstrikes from carrier-based aircraft. Hills that had resisted capture for weeks were pounded into rubble. Still, the Japanese clung to their positions, emerging from underground tunnels to fire upon advancing American troops. The capture of key terrain points became the focus. Conical Hill, long a thorn in the side of the U.S. 96th Infantry Division, was taken after days of vicious combat. Nearby, the 1st Marine Division assaulted Sugar Loaf Hill in a series of frontal attacks that left hundreds dead on both sides. The hill changed hands repeatedly before the Marines finally secured it, but at a terrible cost. What ultimately cracked the Shuri line was not a single dramatic breakthrough but the slow, methodical erosion of Japanese defenses. Step by bloody step, the Americans forced their way forward, sealing caves with explosives, clearing bunkers with flamethrowers, and capturing ridge after ridge. Every advance pushed the defenders into a smaller and smaller perimeter. By the end of May, General Mitsuru Ushijima, commander of the Japanese 32nd Army, realized the line could no longer be held. On May 29, under the cover of darkness and torrential rain, his forces began a withdrawal toward the southern tip of Okinawa. They moved silently through the mud, leaving behind booby traps, mines, and small rearguard units to delay the Americans. When U.S. forces finally entered the ruins of Shuri Castle on May 31, they found little more than rubble and empty tunnels. The symbolic heart of the Japanese defense had fallen, but the battle was far from over. The retreating enemy was now concentrated in the south, where they intended to make their final stand. The breaking of the Shuri line marked a turning point in the campaign. For the Americans, it was a hard-earned victory, yet the price had been staggering. Tens of thousands of men had been killed or wounded in the fight for those ridges. For the Japanese, it was the beginning of the end on Okinawa, but they would not surrender. The final act of the battle would be fought in the island's southernmost hills, where desperation would drive the defenders to their most fanatical resistance yet. The Shuri line had fallen, but Okinawa's agony was far from over. As June began, the Japanese 32nd Army had withdrawn into the southernmost reaches of the island, a rugged, rain-soaked landscape of cliffs, ravines, and coral ridges. Here, General Mitsuru Ushijima prepared for the last stand of his battered forces. Every cave, every ridge, and every natural crevice became a defensive position. The Japanese knew there was no escape. They would fight to the death. The American advance into the south began under constant rain. Torrential downpours turned the ground into a sea of mud, bogging down vehicles and making every step a struggle. Tanks often became useless in the steep, waterlogged terrain. Infantrymen trudged forward under heavy fire, while engineers blasted apart fortified caves. Flamethrowers, satchel charges, and demolition teams became the primary tools of attack. By June 5, U.S. forces had reached the Maeda Escarpment, another defensive stronghold. Fighting here mirrored the ferocity of earlier battles, with Japanese troops making suicidal counterattacks under cover of darkness. The U.S. Army Ziv Corps and the Marines of 3 amphibious corps pressed forward, yard by yard, often at a terrible cost. As the Americans closed in, Okinawan civilians were caught in the crossfire. Many had been driven south by the fighting, only to find themselves trapped in the shrinking Japanese perimeter. Terrified by propaganda claiming Americans would commit atrocities, thousands committed suicide, leaping from cliffs into the sea or detonating grenades with their families. It was one of the darkest and most tragic chapters of the entire Pacific War. By mid-June, organized Japanese resistance was collapsing. General Ushijima, realizing the battle was lost, issued his final orders. He instructed his troops to continue fighting, but refused to sanction meaningless suicide charges that would only waste lives. On the night of June 21, with American forces closing in from all sides, Ushijima and his chief of staff, General Isamu Cho, performed ritual seppuku near their headquarters at Hill 89. Their deaths marked the symbolic end of the battle. On June 22, 1945, Okinawa was officially declared secured by U.S. forces. The victory had come at a staggering price: more than 12,000 Americans killed, over 36,000 wounded, and nearly the entire Japanese garrison of more than 75,000 men dead. Civilian casualties were catastrophic. Estimates range from 100,000 to 150,000 Okinawan men, women, and children killed during the campaign. The Battle of Okinawa was the bloodiest single battle of the Pacific War. For the Allies, it provided a sobering preview of what an invasion of the Japanese home islands might cost. The carnage deeply influenced the decision to use atomic bombs in August 1945. For Japan, Okinawa's loss was both a military and psychological disaster, stripping away the last barrier before the homeland. Okinawa's final days were a grim reminder that in total war, victory can come at a cost so high that even the victors are left haunted by the price.